Thank you very much. My my annual membership check is in the mail, so it's on the way. I want to start by thanking Alex for the invitation to be here yet again at this phenomenal community center and bookstore that I know we all love so much. And I want to thank General Hodges for agreeing to be here on this incredibly bad weather night. It's great to be talking with you. It's great to have spoken with you a little bit today and then again at dinner.
When I agreed, I did not know it would be pouring rain, so...
Well, you're the logistics guy. You're supposed to arrange for stuff like this. And I said this to you next door, but I think I want to say it to a public audience. I've worked for 20 plus years with the DOD. I've known a lot of general officers, and I have known very few that people speak of with such respect and such admiration as they do for you. And I know a lot of your former subordinates and people that work with you are here today, came in the rain to see you. So that's a great testimony to you and to your mentorship. Since you retired as SACEUR in 2018, which doesn't feel that long ago, but it is, Europe has experienced COVID, and now it's experienced the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We are literally watching Europe change almost week by week in real time. What has that been like for you, having retired as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and then out of the chair? What has it been like to witness these changes, and what was it that prompted you to say, I really think I need to sit down and write a book about this?
So just to be clear, so that real SACEURs don't take offense, I was the Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe. So I was the Army Component Commander, not the SACEUR. And most of those SACEURs were surprised that I actually became the Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe. But just to be clear about that. When I was a lieutenant in Germany back in 1981, height of the Cold War, I noticed in our concern there in West Germany that people were scurrying around, and there was excitement. And I asked my platoon sergeant, I said, what the hell is going on here? And he goes, the CG of USAR is coming. I said, oh my God. And so I started scurrying, and then I said, what is USAR? I had no idea. So to get to be the CG, Commanding General of USAR 35 years later was a privilege. But it was also a privilege because of the time. I showed up in November of 2014, a few months after Russia had invaded Ukraine and had illegally annexed Crimea. And about that time, the U.S. Army had gone down from 300,000 to 30,000. And the mission, when we had 300,000, was to deter the Soviet Union, protect America's strategic interests, and assure our allies. And then here we are in 2014, and the mission with 30,000 was deter Russia, assure our allies, and protect America's strategic interests. So the task became, how do you make 30,000 look and feel like 300,000? And actually, for a leader, that's the best possible situation, to be given an almost impossible task and not enough resources, because as Churchill once said, gentlemen, we're out of money, now we have to start thinking. And so that book was all about how do you make people, how do you get people to recognize the threat when it's not quite so obvious, and you would rather focus on other threats, like in the Pacific, or like, come on, Russia's not really going to attack, they're not going to do this. And besides, we need these resources that are in Europe, we need to send them elsewhere. So that was the challenge, and frankly, I loved it. I had so many of my friends tell me I was the luckiest SOB in the Army that I got to go back to Europe in that capacity at that time.
One of the themes that comes out in your book is one that I deal with all the time when I go to Europe. It is the issue of whether Europe can begin to defend itself in the event that the United States either cannot, because it has too many other crises to worry about, or a future presidential administration decides that it doesn't want to. So this book is a clarion call, among other themes, for the Europeans to begin to think about their own defense. And you and I had this conversation very briefly at dinner, but I want to ask it to you here as well. What is it? Why do you think it has been so difficult for many Europeans, not all, but many Europeans, to see the threat that Russia poses and to take that threat as seriously as the United States government has?
So every president since Truman has correctly criticized our European allies for not doing enough. I mean, everybody. This is not a recent phenomenon. From Truman all the way up, saying Europeans have got to do more. The United States doesn't have the resources and capacity to do everything. The American taxpayers are like, hey, wait a minute. You know, why are we doing this? Why aren't Germans, French, Italians, why are they doing more? Those are fair questions. But at the same time, the reason we have continued to maintain a presence in Europe and the reason we have continued to be inside the alliance, NATO, the most successful alliance, nobody ever said it was perfect, but the most successful alliance and the oldest alliance in the history of the world is because it's in our interest. That even if not one European country paid €1, £1, 1 krona, or 1 zloty for their defense, it's still in our interest that Europe is stable, secure, and prosperous. The access that we gain, the intelligence sharing that we get from our allies, that's our benefit. So it's still worth it. Now, it depends on where you live in Europe also, and a little bit what generation you are on how you look at defense. There's a reason Finland joined NATO. And our allies in Eastern Europe, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, they're not confused about the threat. I mean, they know what it's like. They understand how terrible it would be for them if Russia were to regain control of those countries or were able to dominate. So they're not confused. That's why they don't need to be pushed to spend more on defense and to do more on defense. That's why all of them have provided huge support in what we've done in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's why they are throwing open the doors to invite us to put troops in those countries, because they understand the threat. If you're in Germany or Italy or Spain, it's like, come on, I mean, there's no way the Russians are not really going to do this. Now, obviously that turned out to be wrong, but I think that was a part of it. In Germany in particular, there is a part of the demographic that carries enormous guilt for what happened, for starting the war, for what they did during the war, both in terms of Holocaust, but the war in general. So every German every German today went through an education process that told them how terrible Germany was, and it's your fault, and we're never going to let this happen again. And then there's a part of the German society that is pacifist, probably because they lost their grandparents or their parents in the war, or their family lost everything, and they can't imagine anything worse than another war. So there is part of that. But I don't buy the whole pacifist thing, because I can remember in the 80s, Germany had the best army in Europe, the biggest army. I was like 14 divisions, thousands of tanks, thousands of howitzers. That was in the 80s. So this is not newfound pacifism, or it is newfound pacifism, because they were very, very good when they saw the threat from the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's the paradox to me. So the Second World War experience did not stop West Germany and East Germany independently from having very large armies during the Cold War. So the Second World War isn't a complete explanation. Maybe it's German unification, maybe it's a kind of desire to play a new role. But Germany seems to sit in a particularly unusual position. It has, of course, this unbelievable economic power that it's got, but it seems reluctant to play the kind of strategic role in Europe that would be appropriate for a country of its economic power. And again, I'm like you. I'm not convinced that the Second World War is the appropriate explanation. So could you maybe talk a little bit about the Zeitenwende, this kind of German desire to spend 100 billion euros to change its energy policy? How successful do you think that has been, and how much of a sea change has there really been in the German mindset?
I think and by the way, I live in Frankfurt. The last 6 years since I retired, my wife is an incredible German-American woman. She says I am the laziest German student she has ever met. So my language is not good enough that I can do interviews in German. So I can't claim to be the expert on Germany, but I spend a lot of time with German friends and family members on these topics. Germans, I think they don't trust themselves, actually. There's a part of that Germans don't trust, and the idea of being leaders in Europe, or setting the example of military strength again, they are having a hard time getting their head around that. And I think part of that's historical. Part of it, although also is they got it pretty good. They're spoiled. They're spoiled. They have a nuclear shield provided by the United States, and they've got, for the first time in German history, there are only friends on every border. Not during football season, you can be sure, but when it comes to actual security, they're allies, NATO allies, or partners that are like Switzerland, that are on the border.
In fact, they have countries on their border, including Poland, that are asking Germany to do more. So a Polish friend of mine who likes the line, if we're okay with German tanks in Poland, the Germans should be okay with German tanks in Poland. But I think what you said earlier today, this notion that Germany would exercise its influence on the world stage through economics and not through hard power, seems to be dying really, really hard.
Yeah, there is this Wandeln durch Handeln, change through economic relation, through economy. There was a belief, a philosophy, that people believed, the Russians, yes, of course, we don't like them, but if we have good, strong economic relations with Russia, that will change their approach. And they'll want to be more westernized, they'll become capitalists, they'll love us, and then we don't have to have all this defense stuff because they'll be so closely tied to us, Germany, in business. And I think a lot of Germans really believe that. Of course, convenient when your economy is based on export of really good quality cars and other products that Russians were buying up as fast as they could. And in return, of course, Germany was getting very, very cheap oil and gas from Russia. So this was an agreement that I think they became spoiled. That's and they didn't want anybody messing with that. And I believe that this war in Ukraine is partly is the result of failed deterrence. This is what failed deterrence looks like. And part of that failed deterrence was the Kremlin looking at Germany still building Nord Stream 2 late into 2021. And so I think on top of all the other things, our failure to respond to Georgia, Syria, the first invasion of Ukraine, the chaos here in America on January the 6th, criticisms of NATO by the former president, criticism of NATO by the French president. I think the Russians were thinking, we should go ahead and finish the job in Ukraine because clearly the West is not going to do anything.
So I'd like to go back to that moment of that first invasion of Ukraine, the Russian seizure of Crimea in 2014. You were in Turkey at that point, is that right?
That's correct.
So you were a two-star commander of land forces?
I was a lieutenant general, commander of NATO's Allied Land Command in Izmir, Turkey.
So I think I've demoted you twice already now, haven't I? I made you a two-star when you were a three-star.
You've overcompensated from 4-star to 2-star.
All right, so we're even is what you're telling me.
Only my mother ever thought I would make it anyway, so it's okay.
I want to go back to that moment. In retrospect, I'm astonished, both that the Americans and the Europeans watched Russia just take the Crimean Peninsula, and that wasn't the wake-up moment. And I want you to kind of walk us through how you were seeing that in 2014. Were you surprised that nobody seemed to really want to push back against that? And why do you think so much of the world was so complacent at what in retrospect seems like an unbelievable act of aggression that the international community should have done something about? Big question.
So I've never trusted Russia, ever. The book of treaties that they have lived up to would be the smallest book in this bookstore. I mean, they have no record or tradition of living up to agreements unless they were absolutely forced to it. And I think if you talk to people from Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Poland, you name it, they know that. And I never trusted them. And I always thought that they only would respect strength. That doesn't mean that we can't have a relationship with them, that we can't have Olympics and trade and do things. I had the chance to visit St. Petersburg and Moscow when I was a younger officer, and I hope I'll get to go back there again one of these days. But I think we have been so naive for so long, thinking that they just want to be like us. And I also confess that when the wall came down, it's like, yes, finally Germany can be reunified. All the work that the United States, 15 million Americans, by the way, wore U.S. uniform in Germany after the war. I mean, that's a commitment by the United States. Over 15 million Americans, Army, Navy, Air Force, and even a couple of jarheads, all served in Germany, in the Cold War. And it's like, it was worth it. Finally, we won. But we were so naive because we failed to anticipate that we were going to win. We hadn't planned for it. Thankfully, when the wall came down, nobody lost control of nuclear weapons. But because we had failed to anticipate this, we were not prepared for the economic implications. And we sort of just thought, well, they're going to be capitalists and it's all going to work out. Well, of course, capitalism and democracy, if a country doesn't have the institutional foundation for that, it's not going to work. And we had done none of the preparation necessary, which is what I hope people are doing now, that we should not be scared that the Putin regime might collapse, but instead we should be anticipating it so that we are prepared to make sure that nuclear weapons don't get out of control, who controls the oil and gas infrastructure, where does all the money go, because it won't be a peaceful transition, I'm sure, but we should not fear it. Now, to the point of your question, I had good German friends, very well educated. Germans like titles, like doctor. I mean, that's a big deal. And sometimes they're even doctor. I mean, there are two doctors, and that's a big deal to them. And I met this gentleman who was a doctor, the most renowned scientist in his field in Germany, and he said, "Come on, Ben, there's no way that Russia is going to." This is before the second invasion. He said, "There's no way Russia's going to attack. First of all, why do you even care about Crimea? That's always been Russia." Now, I'm not talking about a guy that walked in out of the woods. This is doctor, professor. It's always been Russia. And that's part of the problem, is that so many of the Germans accept that. And there has been, over the history between Russia and Prussia and other parts of what became Germany, a relationship with whereas actually World War I and World War II were the anomalies. Those were the exceptions to the centuries of relationship there. And so when you've got well-educated people, and then of course in the United States, the same people that were in the Obama team, that were the Russia experts, they're the same ones that are in the Biden team, and they continue to believe that somehow, we can't let Russia fail, we need to somehow protect that. And I think we just keep getting it wrong. So I could be challenged on that, and I'll accept that challenge, but all the evidence that I see, this war could have ended last year if we'd have decided, recognized it's in our interest that Ukraine defeats Russia back to the 91 border, and we would be talking about something else tonight.
Yeah, unfortunately, of course, we're not. And we don't want to completely disparage some of the efforts the Europeans have made. Poland has made remarkable strides, and Sweden and Finland have come into NATO. Did those efforts surprise you, and do you think that's an indication that maybe things are starting to turn in the right direction?
So Poland has made so many good decisions, good moves, strengthened their military politically. They were starting to drift away from the European Union. Now they've got a government that is more in line democratic principles. It's a terrific ally. You don't have to wonder, will the Poles show up? Well, defense-wise, there are 10,000 American soldiers and airmen in Poland today, 10,000. Half of them, by the way, are National Guard and Reserve. Poland has become the hub for much of what we're doing in Europe. And they know how this movie ends. If Ukraine fails and Russia will continue heading into Poland. So they're not going to sit behind the Vistula River. They will come into Western Ukraine to prevent that from happening. So Poland you can count on. They're a little frustrated with us for not recognizing it sooner. Our Baltic allies, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they're like, we told you. We've been telling you for 30 years, and now it's coming true. And of course, Estonia has given everything they have to Ukraine. And Estonia has a border with Russia, but they understand how important this is. And in Germany, actually, when the German government does what needs to be done, there's no protests in the streets. I mean, they actually are very practical. It's a certain part of the governing sort of part of Germany that is terrified, but most Germans actually understand what's at stake and that, okay, we were wrong here, we got to fix it now. There were not huge protests when Zeitenwende was announced, 100 billion. I think most Germans actually are frustrated that the German Bundeswehr, the military, is not at the level that it was in the 80s in terms of quality and quantity. They know that needs to be done. And just like Americans, if the leadership, the civilian leadership, will explain to the population what's at stake, why this is important, then I think most people say, okay, that makes sense.
So I want to get your perspective on how you read Russia. So I think the American media, I see sort of two depictions of Russia in the American kind of blogosphere. One is these 20-foot giants who are able to manipulate the entire world, and the other is an aging society with a GDP the size of Spain's that can't do anything right. How do we square those two images, and how do you read Russia? What is Russia in your mind?
Well, that is a terrific question, Mike, because we do seem to be schizophrenic a little bit about how we interact with Russia. The fact is, they have thousands of nuclear weapons, and they don't care how many innocent people they kill. And so there is a fear that, I think excessive fear, but there's a fear that if we do certain things, that will finally provoke them into using a nuclear weapon. Now, I think this is excessive fear because there is no plausible way in which they would use them, but they see how we deter ourselves because of the threat of a nuclear weapon, and that affects how we think about things, which, by the way, I think is a terrible signal to send to countries that have or want to get their own nuclear weapons, that the United States can be blackmailed by the threat of a tactical nuclear weapon. I'm not talking about, strategic, I'm talking about tactical nuclear weapons, and yet we are so hesitant to do things that need to be done because of that. Now, on the other hand, and that was the Spanish economy, with all due respect to our Spanish allies, I heard that from Germans all the time. Come on, Russia will never attack. Their economy is the size of Spain or Italy, which is true. Of course, nobody in the Kremlin cares whether or not families are unhappy that they don't have a car or washing machines or, the things that Americans would demand. And Putin doesn't have to answer to a serious legislative body or a serious journalist. And so they're able to do things to keep them in the fight. And because we have failed to use all of our economic tools, where Russia is still exporting oil and gas to India and China, out through the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, below market price, but they're still getting enough money to do what they need to do to stay in the war. So I think they still have enough people that they can keep feeding into the meat grinder, but they've lost, we're coming close to 600,000 troops now killed and wounded. And there's at least 1 million military-aged men who left Russia that would rather be anywhere than sent to Ukraine. So it's not inexhaustible. And it's also, as you highlighted, it's a aging, now that I'm 66, aging takes on a different meaning than it did a few years ago. But you would not want me as a private in your army for sure. It is an aging, unhealthy population. And the Russian Federation is spread over like 72 different entities, different oblasts, different countries, Chechnya, for example. So it's not 140 million people that are prepared to die for Crimea. We think that, and Putin would like us to think that. And I think we're going to be surprised one day, just like we were in 1989, when the whole thing collapses and you realize that other than nuclear weapons, They're not a threat. They've been fighting Ukraine for 10 and a half years with every advantage. Every advantage. We have not even said we want Ukraine to win. Most of what we give Ukraine is old equipment, old ammunition, including the Bradley fighting vehicle that used to be parked in front of AHEC, was refurbished and is now in Ukraine lighting up Russian BMPs. So, I mean, that's been our support. And they still only control less than a fifth of Ukraine. Most of the Black Sea Fleet is underwater. The Ukrainians just sank a Russian submarine.
Yep.
And so, if we got serious on using the economic tools and had the political will to say, because it's in our interest, the United States, it's in our interest, in the interest of our European allies that Ukraine wins, that this would have been over last year.
All right, we're running now to the end, so now I'm going to ask you actually hard questions. Are you ready? All right. You and your co-authors wrote, "It would be wrong to assume that the United States and Russia are headed for another Cold War." You wrote this before the invasion of Ukraine, after the invasion of Crimea, but before the invasion of Ukraine. Do you still believe that?
So I've thought about this quite a bit. The phrase Cold War, I mean, before 2022, people say, are we in a new Cold War? And I don't know that that's a useful construct anymore, because as I look around the room, most of you were out of high school at some point during the Cold War. And it was, that meant something. You had huge armies on both sides, thousands of nuclear weapons. We were ready to go. We were committed. But there was a stability sort of thing, and there was this understanding. Now, what Russia does, and China and others, they have taken what we call hybrid warfare to a new level of absolute total corruption, murdering people or attempting to murder people, cyber theft, disruption of elections, things that did not happen, at least not on that scale, during the Cold War. So I don't know if it's helpful to think of us as in another Cold War. In fact, the Russians, I don't believe they think in terms of at war, not at war, like we do. We tend to think, okay, thank God we're not at war. The Russians are always at war. It's just different ways of exerting power on that will go from cyber to murdering a guy in the Tiergarten in Berlin, to trying to kill the head of Germany's Rheinmetall, their biggest defense company, to disrupting our elections, pouring gas on every flame with the right-wing extremist organizations in Europe, but also left-wing, anything that causes us to lose trust and confidence in our institutions. That's different from Cold War.
I want to get your opinion on one more thing, and then Alex will probably give me the hook to start asking to get questions from the audience. But I think one other thing that might be different, and you and your co-authors in the book say that thinking of this as Cold War 2.0, the phrase you guys use is it's a lazy construct. Could another difference be that the Cold War was in fact ideological, so that there were fellow Soviet travelers in the West, and this Putin is not ideological in the same sense that the Soviet Union was? He's just out for Russian gain. So if you're living in France or you're living in Holland, the threat can feel further away. Do you see that as a difference?
Okay, that's probably a smarter way to look at it. This is not about communism versus democracy or anything. This is about a gigantic criminal organization that cares only about making a very small percentage of its people rich, but it uses the idea of great Russia and this empire, and that we were screwed over by the West after the end of the Cold War. The United States lied about NATO enlargement, all of these things. But these are devices used by the leadership in the Kremlin to keep people focused on external threats that don't exist versus how terrible it is. I mean, the idea that NATO was ever going to attack Russia, the safest part of Russia's border was that 8% that touched a NATO country. I mean, that was the one place from which they were never going to be attacked. Estonia, even if the Estonians wanted to go in there and give them a good kicking, it was never going to happen. But he needed to talk about the threat from NATO and NATO encirclement. If you ever look at a map of Russia and look at the part that touches NATO, Russia is not being encircled. They need to be a lot more worried about the Chinese and Islamic extremism coming out of Central Asia than they do getting attacked by Poland or Estonia or the United States. But it's a criminal entity. They care nothing for the international rules-based order. They hate it. And this is where Russia, China, Iran, others work together, not as allies, but they have an interest in turning the world upside down. The world that was created after World War II with respect for sovereignty, respect for human rights, respect for freedom of navigation, respect for international agreements, the so-called international rules-based order, that's what they hate. That's what they want to destroy because it makes it more difficult for them to run their criminal enterprises.
And that sums up much of what Ann Applebaum argued sitting in this seat, I guess, a couple of weeks ago.
I have been plagiarizing from her for years.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to turn it to Alex in the audience, I suppose.
If you have a question, we'll check 1, 2. Yes, if you have a question, just raise your hand.
Got to go to the guy in the
here and then
Steelers
here.
shirt first. That's a must. Second, I guess.
Back in the late 1990s, there were a lot of very smart people, Russia experts, people who understood Russia for a long time, like George Kennan, Richard Pipes, Arthur Hartman, a lot of former ambassadors to Moscow, that warned President Clinton in a public letter, if you go forward with NATO enlargement, it will be the biggest mistake in the post-Cold War era. And George Kennan wrote a piece for the New York Times saying the same thing. Do you give any credence at all to the notion that NATO enlargement has caused any of what Russia has done? And if I can add one more point, back in 2008, President Bush publicly talked about inviting Ukraine into NATO. And William Burns at the time, who later became CIA director, told him, that is the red line of all red lines for Russia, Ukraine in NATO. If you do that, it won't be just Vladimir Putin that opposes you, it'll be any Russian leader. So do you give any credence to that at all?
Well, I think the question should be asked, who are we to tell countries that no longer want to be under the threat of Russian occupation, which they've experienced for the past 300 years? Who are we to tell them, bad luck, the Russians don't want you to join NATO, so we're not going to allow it? All of the countries that have joined the alliance since the original 12 did so as soon as they possibly could, because they saw the only chance for having security from Russia lay with becoming a part of NATO. And so I also have a problem. I'm not totally naive, but this is not the 18th century when 3 or 4 countries would get together and say, okay, you can have those, you can have those, you can have those. This is it's a different time. And so the idea of supporting democratic countries that are looking for security so that they can be prosperous, like other Western Europe, is something that we should support. Now, I think for sure we could have been much more clear-eyed and clever about how we communicated to the Russians about this. If they really, really were fearful of somehow this was a big, clever Western trick to get a bunch of nuclear weapons right next to them to then destroy Russia, we had a responsibility to address those things. But actually, I think we did all the various arms control agreements. The U.S. was not the one who ever broke any arms control agreement or violated them. One of our challenges is that we are so transparent and so vulnerable, an open society, as opposed to the Russian side. So I don't accept today that it's somehow our fault that Russia attacked Georgia or that Russia attacked into Ukraine. I don't see it's our fault. We actually tried we were naive at the end of the Cold War, trying to reach out to Russia as partners. I can remember having Russian troops with us in Bosnia with the implementation force. When NATO made the decision to finally put an end to the fighting in Bosnia, we invited the Russians to be a part of it. That's incredible. I remember I was the aide de camp to the SACEUR, General Jowin at the time, and we were visiting, seeing troops that was at Thanksgiving, and you know the Army at Thanksgiving, I mean, you want to be there. It's these Russian soldiers that were eating in an Army mess hall, they could not believe how they had fallen into heaven. And these guys were like Dan Aykroyd on Trading Places. They were stuffing M&Ms and food into their pockets, and they couldn't believe that they were getting to do that. So we had Russian troops with us in Bosnia. And I think that it's people like Vladimir Putin who turned their back on the opportunity. He doesn't fear Ukraine becoming a NATO country. He fears Ukrainians becoming a prosperous, liberal, democratic society. And then he has a really hard time explaining that to his own people, why these stupid Ukrainians are all of a sudden so much better off. I think that's the thread. I didn't completely directly address your good points. And it's, who am I to say, well, George Kennan, what does he know?
So, as you were describing the countries that are along the border there, we skipped over Hungary. And
not intentionally, but thank you.
But as a kind of nightmare scenario that seems to occur as we look at some of the transactions between authoritarian types, what happens if Putin cuts a deal with Orban that allows for a Russian presence and a Russian ally presence in Hungary? Because then all of a sudden you got a dagger at the heart of Europe.
This is an excellent question, and it is a real problem. Hungary and also Slovakia, the Fico government, are, I would say, openly pro-Russian, or certainly very tolerant. And Prime Minister Orban recently announced that they're going to open up, allow Russians to have visas to come into Hungary. And then once they're inside Hungary, then they're inside Schengen. And nobody else in Europe is very happy about this. So you are seeing and hearing more and more Europeans talk about somehow blocking Hungary inside the European Union or forcing them out. I hope we can find a solution other than that, because then you'll still have you'll have a country, a European, that's also a NATO ally, by the way, with very good military capabilities. It's not a good situation. But this is where I think American leadership has got to be consistent and firm and help provide an example of strong liberal democratic values. We have to live up to our own talking points. And I have a lot of European friends who'll say, well, you guys, we know you've never been perfect, but at least you were always the ideal. We've lost a little bit of that. And that makes it a little bit more difficult for us to criticize Hungary.
General, you mentioned that your job as USER CG was to make your 30,000 look like the 300,000 we used to have back in the 80s. The corollary to that, I recall you saying at one time, was that what we had to defend back in the 1980s was the inter-German border between West Germany and East Germany, a much smaller piece of territory than what we have to defend now with NATO, which is the entire Russian border. No. And we've recently added another 870 miles to that border by welcoming Finland and Sweden into NATO. I'd love to get your thoughts on whether that's a net plus for us, or whether, and our alliance, or whether we've bitten off more than we can chew.
Thank you. Of course, NATO got better the day that Sweden and Finland both joined the alliance. You're talking about two countries that have strong, vibrant, liberal democratic societies, populations that are resilient. I mean, not just physically fit, but educationally. I mean, that's a plus in terms of societies being added to the alliance. They both have very capable militaries, especially Finland, as you would expect, and as you probably know, their ability to mobilize hundreds of thousands of troops very quickly, something that they practice all the time, which is why Russia has never invaded them again, because of their ability to get capability into the field. I mean, they're very good. I've been to their exercises. It's impressive. And then both countries have really good defense industry. And so I see nothing but pluses. The geography of the Baltic Sea, obviously significantly better for NATO now. Every country around the Baltic Sea except Russia literally is a NATO country. So in the list of President Putin's strategic disasters that he created, one of them will be the addition of Finland to NATO, because that doubled the amount of border that now touches NATO. But interestingly, he's taken all the Russian troops away from there because he needs them in Ukraine. So he clearly never really saw NATO as a threat to Russia. And this also changes the geography a little bit up in the high north. As the polar ice cap continues to melt, that changes the situation up there. Having two Nordic countries that are allies also is a plus for us.
Sir John Bonin, the command structure in Europe has changed since you were there.
They had a lot to fix, let me tell you.
So that's what I want to know is what do you think of the new command structure that combined two of your former positions into one but put a 4-star in it?
Well, he's earning every penny he's getting, I guarantee you that. It makes sense. The Navy and the Air Force, as they often do, disregarded DoD guidance and so they kept the 4-star that had U.S. Air Force Europe was also Air Command, the NATO hat. The Navy guy was JFC Naples and U.S. Navy Europe and Navy Africa. So this is actually the Army getting it right, I think. And they've been smart about getting enough deputies in there with enough firepower to be able to do the LANCOM part and the Africa part and the Europe part. But there's no joke. You can imagine any commander and command sergeant major having to cover that many different countries and those kinds of events. But I think it was the right decision. And anything that improves the integration of U.S. Army with NATO is always going to be a good step.
Maybe we ought to note, just for folks that don't know, the U.S. military's Africa Command is also based in Germany, and increasingly people are thinking of, because of the migration problem from Africa into Europe, thinking of that as one kind of strategic and geographic space. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to that. But.
Well, people in Spain, Portugal, and Italy and Greece are much more worried about what's happening in Africa than they are in Ukraine. So they because for them the biggest threat is uncontrolled migration, and so yeah, I don't know how it's taught at the War College, but usually we tend to draw boundaries, and then we assign commanders, and then we say, here's your task. When in fact I think strategically you should say, here's the task that's got to be done. You're in charge of it. And then you figure out the boundaries. And I think, of course, there is some limit somewhere, but the fact that our boundary between U.S. European Command and U.S. Central Command is the border between Turkey and Syria, you would have a hard time finding a worse place to put that boundary. So when you talk about Africa and Europe, I mean. I remember a commander of U.S. Africa Command, he said, Hodges, you have no idea what we're dealing with here. And he pulled up his map with the continent of Africa, and there were 3 USA maps inside the boundary of Africa. I had no idea. I mean, of course I knew Africa was big, but 3 times the size of the continental United States. I mean, that's a hell of a challenge. Trying to figure out how do you provide security, who do you work with, and it can't be a oh by the way kind of thing from the U.S. government. So otherwise it's not sustainable, and we are losing to Russia and China in Africa right now, and even the French, which have long interest there. They've had to pull out of Mali as well. So I think this is going to be a problem for us for quite some time.
Sir, Mark Gerner, I haven't been here in some time, but the last time I started digging into Army doctrine, and I'm going to ask you to put on your U.S. Army hat. So if you were the Chief of Staff of the Army, or you were whomever is approving the multi-domain operations that is now doctrine, of course, in 5 domains, and of course I'm certain many of the people in the room understand that it's no longer air, land, and sea, but it's also space is a domain and cyber is a domain. And I guess you can take your pick as to who's in charge of space and for what purpose. Given that, and going back to your point earlier about the 600K, I would respectfully submit, so what? So he's lost 600K. Do you want to get into some psychological analysis of one person and give him credit that he can take that history and say 600K means a lot to me? His actions have proven that he's not deterred. So my only question to you would be, and it's just a thoughtful question perhaps, is what does deterrence mean in all your experience? What does it mean now, given that you've got 5 domains you're responsible for now? And that means every combatant commander is responsible for those 5 domains. So you can say your experiences as a lieutenant here and a captain there, they're very interesting and they're highly important. But what is your, if you have such an assessment, I don't want to put you on the spot.
I
but,
think you just did.
So what would deter Mr. Putin then, in your opinion, with the 600K he's lost?
Okay. Well, first of all, if I was made Chief of Staff of the Army, the first thing I would do is give everybody the day off so I could figure out what the hell I had to do, give myself some time. So if your question is just flat out about deterrence inside a multi-domain construct, it's whichever doctrinal model we're using, deterrence is all about having capability, demonstrated capability, and demonstrated will to use a capability that would tell your adversary that they will be crushed or they will suffer so much loss that it won't be worth it. I mean, it's that simple, and I think each one of you has dealt with that in your own personal life, or teaching your kids about deterrence. So with Vladimir Putin, I think he will continue what he's doing until he realizes he can't win. And right now, he believes he can still win because he's not impressed, I think, with the political will of the West. Certainly not of the United States or Germany or even UK and France and others. I think he looks at the fact that we have not said we want Ukraine to win, the fact that we have not given them everything they need, the fact that we have not used all of our economic tools. And because he doesn't care that he's lost 600,000, because that's not important for him, and he doesn't have to worry about popular support in Russia, at least not yet. I'm not sure that's going to last forever. But as long as he thinks he can just wait for things to develop in the American elections, other places, I think he will continue doing what he's doing. So he has not been deterred yet, for sure.
Thanks for your insights. The questions are going to get a lot more simple now. For those of us who don't have experience inside the military, you can't hear me? Thank you. So for those of us not inside the military, a couple of simple questions. I had understood we had done a lot of sanctioning. We've stopped doing business. We froze, the money of the oligarchs and so on. And it seemed like we had used a lot of our economic tools. So I'd like to know what economic tools we're not using. I'm curious about how we would influence countries like China and India to not do business with Russia. And secondly, could you say what you mean by technical nuclear weapons?
So First of all, the economic tools, the main thing is how do you isolate Russia from, or prevent them from exporting oil and gas, which they're still able to do. And of course, you have to have a buyer, and that's primarily China and Russia. But not only, I mean, there are still European countries that are still getting some of their energy from Russia. So it takes enormous political will and diplomatic capability to get everybody to agree to stop doing that, and without it looking like this is a clever U.S. ploy to expand our access to the market to get them buying American gas, although that would be obviously one of the solutions. So there's that's a part of it. I can't believe that we have not been able to figure out a way to stop Iran from delivering these Shahed drones, that North Korea is sending hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery ammunition, but also ballistic missiles to Russia. China clearly is providing components that Russia should not be able to get that are needed for some of their more sophisticated weapon systems. I know Secretary Blinken has been working with the Chinese trying to stop this, but we haven't yet figured out how to bring to bear all the pressure needed to completely cut that off. How Russia is able to use their what's called the shadow fleet, which are oil tankers that are not in compliance with international law. They don't follow all the rules. When they go through the Baltic Sea and out through the Danish Straits, most ships stop and take on a Danish pilot to allow them to get through all the islands. These ships ignore that. And so far, we have not stopped them. In international law, Denmark, for example, could stop these ships from coming through because they represent a terrible potential environmental hazard. I mean, these are not first-line tankers. And once they get out, then they transload oil to a Russian ship out in international water. So those are examples of where I think we have fallen short. Now, Ambassador Dan Fried, some of you know Dan Fried. He is the foremost expert on sanctions that I know of, somebody at his level. And he told me, he said it is long, hard, tedious work. The Russians, just like other crime organizations, know ways to launder money, to hide it, to put it in their kids' names, or do other things to avoid losing everything. So we have made a lot of progress. Russia is not able to make the same quality weapons that they used to. The steel that's required to make brand new cannon barrels, for example, or cannon ammunition. The fact that they're having to import drones from Iran says a lot, but they're still able to make enough to keep killing innocent Ukrainian civilians. And so on the nuclear weapons, I think when most of us hear about nuclear weapons, you have a picture in your head of Hiroshima or Dr. Strangelove, end of the world kind of detonations. But actually, during the Cold War, the Soviets and the United States developed weapons that were tactical nuclear weapons that were a much lower yield for the time, 70s, 80s. The Soviets would use them, had intended to use them to blow a gap in NATO defenses somewhere in West Germany. And then they had thousands of troops that were trained and equipped to operate in a contaminated environment that could exploit that gap for a few days, and then other forces would come through. So not something that would destroy entire cities or countries, but had a local tactical effect. Now, a tactical nuclear weapon can still have enormous blast effect, but they can also be detonated with a very localized effect. And of course, it depends on is it detonated as an airburst, or is it one that hits the ground? So there's a lot of different variations. The point of the distinction is that to use a tactical nuclear weapon, you have to get it, You have to put it on however you're going to deliver it, whether it's an airplane or a rocket launcher or something like that. And then you have to have a target that you would hit. And you would be willing to accept catastrophic consequences from the United States. For what benefit? And this is why I think it's almost 0% chance of Russia would actually use one of these weapons that would not give them a huge advantage. In fact, it would give them no advantage on the battlefield. There are only downsides for them if they do that. In my opinion.
Sir, Mary Foster. I have two questions. First one is, what assessment do you make of, in the context of the rules-based order, what is your assessment of Western activity in Kosovo in 1999 and also the seriously unpopular 2003 Iraq invasion on the thinking of the Russians and the Chinese? Like, how did that affect their strategic calculus, if you would? And the second question is to go back to your comment about
That
Poland.
first question was like a course at the War College.
Regarding your statement about Poland, you said that the selling point of NATO was that all these countries wanted to be in NATO so that they wouldn't get attacked, because if they were under the NATO umbrella, Article 5, they're not going to get attacked by Russia. But then you said that Poland is afraid of being attacked by Russia, and that's why we need to be in Poland or whatever. So can you reconcile those two statements, please? Thank you.
I thought that was extremely clear. And I'm glad you came out here tonight, because I was teasing you pretty hard earlier today, and I didn't get a chance afterwards to make sure that. Okay. Poland's concern about being attacked is because they are very worried about U.S. commitment to Europe. If Ukraine fails, and of course, as we talked about earlier today, there's a lot wrong in Ukraine that has to be fixed. So their manning and training system, their recruiting, they've got to fix that. They still have a lot of Soviet mindset in the senior leadership of part of the Ukrainian armed forces. But they won't fail unless we allow them to fail. If we don't provide them what they needed, eventually Russia will have killed enough and will begin to overwhelm them. And so you're going to see millions more Ukrainian refugees going into Poland, going into Germany, going into Romania, which will have devastating consequences for those countries as well. And so if we allow Ukraine to fail, it will be because the United States, Germany, UK, and France, those four in particular, will have allowed it to happen. Will have not had the political will to give Ukraine what they need to actually win and keep them in that fight. And so if that's the case, if we get there, then the Russians will see that the U.S. does not have the political will to help Ukraine win. And I think that's the signal to the Kremlin, like, okay, U.S. doesn't care, there's not political will, there's not popular support, more interested in China. And so the threat, in my assessment, the threat of Russia continuing in the next 2 or 3 years after that goes way up. That's why Poland has fear. You know, NATO is not like a shelter. And if you get in, then you're not going to get wedged. The rain's not going to touch you. It's still a living organism that requires nations to do their part. I mean, I think there are some countries that thought, I'm inside NATO, I don't have to worry, we don't have to spend on defense anymore, we're in NATO. Obviously, that's not how it works. So that's why I say what I say, that Poland is worried, because American commitment, I think as they look into the future, are we going to be there? Now, the first part, okay, so I think I know what you mean on Kosovo. On the Iraq War, I will confess, in 2003, all I cared about, I was a brigade commander in the 101st. We were invading, and I did not spend a lot of time thinking about, is this a good idea or not? You know, and I absolutely believed everything that we thought we were going to find when we got there. And actually, the Iraqis reacted exactly like we thought they would in the first few months. I mean, it was like the Netherlands in 1944. People were out in the street and cheering and all that. How ill prepared was I mentally for what it was we were getting into. And I think that obviously, as you look back in hindsight, it was a terrible decision. Can't unring that bell now, but that was a bad decision that was not in any way connected to 9/11, as far as I can tell, or Afghanistan. So I can't defend it. I'm not going to try and defend it. And it certainly undermined our support, particularly in Germany. I think that was, in Germany, that was the beginning of a real break, how Germans thought about the United States. The favorite sport in Germany is always criticizing the U.S., but this was different.
Mary.
Well, okay, sure. I'm not going to say that the United States or the West has never been hypocritical. Of course, and that's why I said earlier, part of our power has always come from us living up to our own talking points. You know, being that ideal. Nobody in Europe ever thought the United States was perfect, but there's a reason millions of people risk their life to get here because of what it represents. And we really only undermine our own power and influence when we don't live up to our own talking points. So I certainly would take that point.
I'm sorry to say we're past time, so we have time for just one last question, then we'll have to wrap up.
All right, I'll keep it easy. So I hear a lot about deterrence, and that was my question too. So, Ukraine, after the fall of the Soviet Union, had a nuclear arsenal, signed a treaty, eliminated it, and Russia broke the treaty. And I just think a little bit about, we have a lot of concerns with Taiwan and facing off against China. Do you think it's time for Western democracies to rethink the concept of nuclear deterrence? Should Taiwan have a nuclear arsenal to deter China? Should South Korea, Japan, some of the established countries begin to rethink, whether the U.S. umbrella is sufficient to protect them down the road?
So I can't see any positive outcome of more countries having nuclear weapons, for starters. I mean, I think we would want to continue to live up to the non-proliferation agreements. More countries having nukes, there's nothing good about it. However, I think countries are one of the lessons that they're taking from this Russian war against Ukraine is, if you ever get nukes, don't ever give them up. That's probably a little bit simplistic, but lots of Ukrainians today are saying, why did we do that? Not only did Russia not live up to the agreement of the Budapest Memorandum, the United States and UK also did not live up to our guarantee of their sovereignty. Deterrence, when we talk about capability, there's nuclear deterrence, of course, that's a part of it. Germany is very concerned that if there is a Trump administration, that President Trump would withdraw American nuclear shield for Germany. And that affects how they think about their willingness to help Ukraine, because they don't want to be left vulnerable to Russian nuclear threats. Because unlike UK and France, they don't have their own nuclear weapon. So that already affects people's strategic thinking. But deterrence is also about readiness. I mean, do you have women and men in your formations that are trained, have what they're supposed to have, whether we're talking about air, land, sea, all the domains? Do you have enough ammunition? Do you have fuel? I mean, it's real capability, not just nuclear. And do societies have a resilience that we can resist the attempts to create divisions in our society that cause us to lose trust in our elections, lose trust in our courts, lose trust in our electoral process, in our media, that everywhere that they can make progress in those areas, degrading our trust makes us more vulnerable. So part of deterrence is having really strong societies. Not perfect, everybody doesn't get along, but solid, that can resist those kinds of attempts. That's also a part of deterrence. And so it always boils down to positive leadership, unifying leadership. To me, that's just as important as having a really, really good nuclear force.
We're going to sneak in one last question under the wire.
I believe that the more sovereign nations in the world, the better. But back in 2015, China, India, and Russia all decided they were going to make a pact that became BRICS. BRICS, the gold-backed currency. And right now, Russia and China are going to places like Africa, and they're saying, look, we'll let you be sovereign. We want to offer trade with you, and you don't have to turn your kids gay. You can, if there's some fat bald guy who's trading sex for food, you can kill him, and we don't care. So how does America fight against people offering sovereignty that have planned this out since 2015? Because a U.S. shell like the one from that factory that burned down in Scranton cost $6,000. A Russian shell cost $600. A North Korean shell cost $60. We can't war needs manufacturing, and we don't have it. How can we possibly win?
Well, first of all, thanks for that question. I would take our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen any day. All right, maybe some have crazy tattoos, maybe some of them do, have different lifestyles, but you put an American soldier on the battlefield against anybody in the world, that's an easy pick. And I think that we see from history that authoritarian governments, dictatorships, in the end always fail. They always fail. And your analogy of North Korean ammunition, Russian ammunition, and U.S. ammunition, yeah, of course there's a price difference. There's also a gigantic quality difference, okay? And I would not want to put North Korean 155 round in any American howitzer, because that thing is probably going to blow up inside the tube. The point is, our defense industry is not a charity. It will respond to political will as expressed in terms of we need to make 500,000 rounds of artillery ammunition. They'll make it. So this is about political will. I don't know how you in Pennsylvania could say we don't have the industrial capacity to make what needs to be made in Pennsylvania, or for people in Ohio to say we can't compete anymore. Give me a break. We can make anything in the world that needs to be made, but the government has to say, this is in our interest. We're going to I need 8 zillion artillery rounds. Here's a gigantic check. Make it happen. Actually, the government is putting a ton of money into growing the chip industry in the United States. So it's a fair question, and the government is actually addressing that very specific thing. Look, it's not perfect here. I acknowledge that, but when you have a government that unleashes the talent of young people, whatever flavor they are, whatever their lifestyle is, you unleash the talent of American kids, and nobody can stand up against that. We have incredible people that just need the opportunity, need to let that potential be developed. And you don't find a whole lot of young people in Russia or China or North Korea saying, I really like it here. I want to stay because I feel I can really reach my full potential. They are leaving by the millions to get away from that.
Could we give one more round of applause for General Hodges and Michael Neiberg?